This is part 2 of the Leo's disco lights video, and basically in the original one, when you push the lights on with the button, they were all basically the same brightness, and you could vary the brightness using the slider in the show page. With this version, we're using the variable resistor on the top, which is this one here, to control the brightness of the lights. And so we can still change the colors, but we now have the ability to make them brighter or dimmer. And we do this using the variable resistor. So next, let's see how we put it together. For this project, you're going to need one JackBord that's charged up, a top, a JackBord light stick, one M4 nut and bolt, one 20 centimeter female-female jumper wire, and 9 10 centimeter female-female jumper wires. For the construction, basically the steps are the same as for the first video. The primary difference being that we're adding the variable resistor. So I'm just going to take these wires out and I'll do it again so that we can see how it works. So basically, pin 3 on the variable resistor, which is on the left hand side, goes to ground on port A. Then pin 2 of the variable resistor goes to pin A2 on port A, like that. And finally we need to get some power to the variable resistor, and in this case it's 3 volts. So we go from pin 1 on the variable resistor goes to the 3 volt line on the JackBord right here. So essentially we've got the variable resistor number 1 connected to port A. Other than that, the rest of the construction is exactly the same as the first video. Check your connections against the pictures that are coming up now, and just make sure that the jumpers are going into the right pins. The color of the jumper doesn't really matter. In this picture we can see the connections to port A. So starting at the left hand side and working our way towards the right hand side, the first wire is the yellow jumper, which goes from pin 1 on the variable resistor to the 3 volt pin on port A. The next pin on port A is a ground, and that goes to pin 3 on the variable resistor. Then we have port pin A2, which goes to pin 2 of the variable resistor. So these 3 pins are the ones that will let us control the brightness of the LEDs. And then lastly we have the orange jumper going from port pin A1 into pin 1 of button 1, and this is the one that lets us toggle the colors. This picture shows the connections to port C1 and for button 2. So we have the white jumper wire coming from port pin C1 and going into pin 1 of button 2, and pin 2 of button 2 goes to ground, which is on port E. And in this view you can also see the data pin from the light stick going to port E1 on port E. This picture shows the connections from the light stick. So starting on port B on the left, the red jumper wire goes from the 5 volt pin on port B into the 5 volt pin on the light stick. Next we have the green ground jumper, and that goes from the ground pin on port B into the ground pin on the light stick. And finally you can see the blue jumper wire, which goes to the data in pin on the light stick, and that goes to port pin E1 on the JackBord. This last picture shows the connections to button 1 and the variable resistor from the inside. And so basically on the left hand side you've got the ground wire going to pin 2 of button 1, and then the orange jumper goes from pin 1 of button 1 into port pin A1. And then for the variable resistor, which is the knob on the right hand side, the green wire on the left goes to ground, the middle wire carries the voltage from the variable resistor to port pin A2, and finally the yellow jumper on the right hand side, which is pin 1 of the pot and the 3 volt pin on the port A, is what provides the power to the variable resistor. To get the code for this project, visit JB.works in your web browser. At the search prompt, enter the TMT code shown below and press enter. Once you see the code on the screen, click the Copy Code button, and this puts the code into the clipboard. Then go to the prog page and paste the code into the area you're working in. Right, now it's time to have a look at the code, and basically the code for this is the same as the previous version, but basically we have a few new variables. So the first one is brightness toggle, or bright toggle, and that just tells us when we're flashing whether we should be on or off. And when we're flashing, we're basically flashing by controlling the brightness of the LEDs between two values. So the first value is the flash brightness, which is the brighter of the two, and then the second one is the dim brightness, and that's basically the dimmer value for flashing. Then we come down here, code's pretty much the same except when we get to this part, which is essentially saying get the voltage from port pin A2 and scale it between 10 and 100, and then put the result in the brightness variable. So if I run the program and then I push the button, so if you watch the video in the corner there, actually let me just choose a better color. Yeah, so as I turn the variable resistor, you can see that the brightness of the LEDs is changing. And so what's happening is this value of brightness is being updated all the time from the variable resistor, and then it's being used here to actually set the brightness value of the LEDs. So we come down to this part, and what we're doing is we're saying, are we flashing? Yes. And then we're saying, are we on or are we off? So that's the brightness toggle. And if we're off, then we're going to set the value of the brightness to dim, and we're going to set bright toggle to 1, which means the next time we come around here, we'll be here, and we set the brightness to the flash brightness, which is the bright one, and then put the toggle to 0. So it's basically a toggle state. And then down here is what happens when we're not flashing. So when we're not flashing, we're just continually updating the flash brightness with the current brightness value. That's why when I turn this to full brightness and I start flashing, it flashes bright, then I press the button, and then I adjust it down a bit, I start it flashing again, and it flashes at the dimmer level. And that's because of the piece of code here, which is continually, when we're not flashing, updating our bright value of the flash. And essentially the code is the same, well, the rest of the code is basically the same as it was in the earlier version. So what's next? Basically you could look at things like changing the pattern of flashing. So right now they just all flash on and off at the same time, all the LEDs being the same color. So you could introduce random colors. You could have different patterns that you could toggle between. So there are all sorts of ways in which you could change the code. So have a go, and if you find something interesting, then send it to us. For more information, visit JB.works.